Welcome back to Monitors Unboxed. 720Hz OLED is here, as today I'm looking at the brand new Asus ROG Swift PG27AQWP-W. This is the fastest of the new 1440p primary RGB tandem W OLED panels from LG Display, offering a 540Hz refresh rate at its native 2560 by 1440 resolution, or a whopping 720Hz in its dual mode 1280 by 720 configuration. Yes, the 720Hz mode runs at just 720p, but this is the fastest we've ever seen a desktop OLED, and we'll show you the motion clarity results later in the review. Essentially, this is a premium, higher spec version of the primary RGB tandem panels that we first reviewed a few months ago. The initial wave focused on 1440p 280Hz models at a more affordable price point, around $600 US, whereas this 540Hz variant is very much a flagship for those with deep pockets. At an MSRP of $1,000 US, it's directly replacing previous gen 480Hz models and competing with the latest 500Hz QD-OLEDs that were released earlier this year. Outside of the new refresh rate capabilities, this 4th gen W OLED panel is very similar to the 280Hz models that also use 4th gen W OLED tech. It has display HDR TrueBlack 500 certification, meaning it retains the higher brightness capabilities first introduced with the 280Hz models, and Asus are pairing this screen with their TrueBlack glossy coating. There's all the other usual features as well, including adaptive sync support. I wouldn't go so far to say the PG27AQWP uses a brand new design, because the general shape and style is similar to previous ROG Swift monitors, but it's fair to say it's received a significant update. The "W" on the end of the name indicates this is a white model, or more accurately silver, with many of the surfaces that were previously grey plastic on other ROG Swift designs now being recolored into silver. The stand pillar, for example, is silver plastic, the rear of the panel is silver, and the silver legs are a new metal mold with cutouts that give it an industrial look. In addition, we get this really cool transparent plastic box design on the back. The ROG logo grid with RGB LED lighting is retained, but the rest of the exterior housing is now transparent, sort of revealing the internal components. For large sections of the design, Asus have created a secondary housing that sits inside this transparent case with various labels on it for a bit of visual interest, but there is a small window that directly shows you the PCB. I really like this design, and it's good to see something a bit unique and interesting in the monitor space as opposed to the standard black plastic housings we usually see. It may not be for everyone, and I suspect with the "W" suffix to the product name, Asus are keeping the door open for a variant with a more traditional design. Also, something to be aware of here is that the transparent housing is a bit less sturdy than the regular ROG Swift monitor build, specifically along the center top edge of the box, where there is an uncomfortable amount of play in the construction. It's not a big deal in regular use, but when handling the monitor or plugging things in, this is an area I'd avoid touching. While the design is a bit different on this monitor, its functionality is identical to previous ROG Swift monitors, so we get height, tilt, swivel, and pivot adjustability with a good maximum height. Out of the bottom of the stand pillar, Asus is still offering their projected logo light, which looks a bit silly and is something I'd disable quickly, but this time it's a light blue color for something a bit different. Asus have used a premium port selection consisting of one DisplayPort 2.1 UHBR20 port, two HDMI 2.1 48 gigabits per second ports, and a 3-port USB hub. However, there's no USB-C input nor KVM switch. While we are getting the highest bandwidth ports currently available, DSC is still required to access 540Hz through both HDMI and DisplayPort. Even UHBR20 is not enough bandwidth for this refresh rate at 1440p. However, as we've said many times on the channel, this is a complete non-issue for gaming that has no impact on the experience. Having access to higher bandwidth DisplayPort does increase the refresh rate you can access with DSC disabled, though weirdly on an RTX 50 series GPU with UHBR20 support, you're forced to use DSC in the UHBR20 mode with refresh rates above 10-bit 120Hz or 8-bit 240Hz. If you drop the DP mode in the OSD to UHBR 13.5, you can use up to 270Hz without DSC, as there are no built-in display modes between 270 and 540Hz. Nothing higher than 270Hz without DSC is possible, despite having the bandwidth to do so. Also, 4K 120Hz downscaling is supported for console users, but only over HDMI. The OSD is controlled through a directional toggle which can be found behind the Asus logo on the front of the display. We're getting the same interface and feature set as the very latest OLEDs from Asus, so this display has one of the most feature-rich offerings on the market. I'll talk about some of these features in just a little bit, but there is lots of stuff in here for gaming, adjusting colors and managing the various OLED care settings. 4th generation W OLED shifts all 1440p panels across to using the new RGWB subpixel layout. The first time we saw this layout was the predecessor to this panel, 1440p 480Hz W OLED, so compared to that panel there is no change. But relative to older and lower refresh rate 1440p W OLEDs, which used an RGWB layout, text quality is noticeably improved and closer to RGB stripe LCDs. There is still some shadowing and artifacts related to the inclusion of the white subpixel, particularly at smaller font sizes, so this panel isn't quite at the level of an LCD. However, I'd say it's reasonably good for a bit of web browsing or document editing. The use of RGWB makes these 4th gen W OLED panels very competitive with the latest high refresh QD-OLEDs. Whether or not it reaches parity with triangle RGB QD-OLED is subjective and even dependent on things like font and text size. QD-OLED has its own issues with pink-green fringing above and below text, so neither panel is artifact-free. I don't have strong thoughts here on which is better. I might slightly prefer QD-OLED, but really, neither is quite as crisp as an IPS LCD, and in general, it's usable for desktop tasks and a non-issue while gaming. The PG27AQWP uses Asus's new TrueBlack Glossy coating, which we first saw on monitors like the XG27AQWMG and XG32UCWMG. Don't you just love monitor names? This type of coating uses a 0% haze with clarity similar to a W OLED TV and with reduced ambient reflections compared to older glossy techniques. Most other 1440p W OLED panels have used a matte finish, including Asus's previous flagship 1440p 480Hz model. Going from matte to glossy has some benefits and some trade-offs. The big benefit is clarity, there's no coating grain, the screen looks crystal clear, and colors appear to pop more, which is a common advantage when comparing glossy to matte. Light doesn't diffuse across the surface of the screen either, which in the right conditions can give it a higher contrast appearance with deeper blacks. The trade-off is direct reflections. The screen no longer diffuses reflected light, so the surface is more like a mirror. The coating and layer structure do a good job of minimizing most reflections, but anything bright tends to cut through and present as a defined reflected object. This can be distracting if you have objects or lights in front of the screen at angles that cause reflections, so you wouldn't want to put this screen opposite a window. I personally really like the glossy finish and prefer it to matte, but the coating that's most suitable for you will depend on your setup. This TrueBlack finish is excellent in darker rooms and quite good in moderately lit environments as well, but it may require some optimization of your setup to minimize reflections. Matte, on the other hand, works better in situations where reflections may be a problem, such as in a brighter room, or where you have less control over lighting and have to use the screen in a specific position. In a sense, matte is a safer bet, whereas glossy has a bigger payoff but more risk. The other main comparison is to QD-OLED Glossy. Again, there's strengths and weaknesses to each approach, but the biggest and most obvious difference is the way each panel handles ambient light. QD-OLED has notorious issues with ambient light reflection in brighter rooms, which causes blacks to appear grey, and this hurts the black depth advantage you get from OLED technology. TrueBlack Glossy W OLED, on the other hand, does not have this issue, so in rooms with moderate to bright lighting, the TrueBlack W OLED panel delivers deeper blacks and a higher apparent contrast ratio. However, Glossy QD-OLED is the stronger of the two for handling direct reflections. Both options have a mirror-like finish, but QD-OLED does a better job of reducing the brightness of reflections, so they don't cut through as much as on the TrueBlack W OLED. In the worst cases, you'll see defined reflections on either panel, but in a side-by-side comparison, QD-OLED reflections are nearly always less obvious. It's also worth noting that in dark or dimly lit rooms, there is basically no difference between either coating. Ultimately, the question is whether Glossy QD-OLED or TrueBlack Glossy W OLED is better. I think most people will prefer the TrueBlack Glossy finish, and I think it's more versatile and usable in a wider range of conditions. In moderately lit rooms, either with artificial or natural light, QD-OLED ambient light reflection is quite obvious, and you just don't get that on Glossy W OLED, which makes W OLED a better choice for gaming both at night and during the day. There is a greater risk of direct reflections on W OLED, but I think that's easier to mitigate and avoid than QD-OLED ambient light reflection. That's just my opinion though. Screen coatings can be quite subjective, so again, it depends on your setup and how you use your monitor. OLED panels of all varieties are susceptible to permanent burn-in. You won't get burn-in while playing games or watching videos, but the panel will burn in over time when displaying static content for long periods. This makes OLED less well suited for productivity uses, where you'll be looking at static desktop apps all day, and you can check out our ongoing OLED burn-in series to see how real-world productivity use affects burn-in. The occasional amount of static app usage is fine, so don't worry about doing a bit of web browsing between gaming sessions. I just wouldn't recommend OLED as a productivity monitor for hours of work. Asus offer an industry-standard 3-year burn-in warranty. The PG27AQWP also features Asus's Neo-Proximity sensor, which we first saw on the PG27UCDM earlier this year. This is a proximity sensor that detects when you aren't sitting in front of the display and automatically turns the screen black, preventing burn-in. After all, there's no point displaying anything when you aren't there to view it. It has adjustable timing and sensitivity settings, and in my testing it just works really well. If you leave your seat, it turns the screen off after a few minutes, sit back down, and it instantly turns back on. It's not a gimmick, I think it's a great feature that strengthens Asus's OLED offering. Response time performance is excellent on this WOLED monitor, which is to be expected. What makes things mildly more interesting than usual is that Asus are quoting a 0.02 millisecond transition time for the PG27AQWP, compared to 0.03 milliseconds for the other OLEDs they've made, including the previous 480Hz PG27AQDP. However, as far as I can tell from my testing, this new panel offers very similar performance to previous OLEDs and is, at best, only slightly faster in terms of transition speed. So as usual, this display technology offers lightning fast response times around the 0.2 to 0.3 millisecond mark, and performance doesn't change at lower refresh rates, one of the many benefits of OLED for variable refresh rate gamers. Unlike with some LCDs, you don't need to adjust settings depending on the refresh rate you're using. There is effectively no difference in response time performance between this WOLED and other OLED variants, including QD-OLED models. OLEDs are much faster than LCDs and have benefits such as no overshoot artifacts, consistent performance across the refresh rate range, and cumulative deviation indicative of near-ideal behavior. With transition times an order of magnitude faster, OLEDs have around a 1.5 times advantage in clarity over an LCD at the same refresh rate. This means a 540Hz OLED offers a similar experience to an 800Hz LCD, which currently don't exist. Aside from comparisons to LCDs, the main thing you need to be aware of when buying an OLED for motion is that clarity on these panels is directly tied to refresh rate. At the same refresh rate, two different OLED monitors will look the same, so the actual refresh rate you'll be using while gaming is more important than the maximum refresh rate of the monitor. If you compare two OLEDs, one with a 280Hz max refresh and one with a 540Hz max refresh, but both are playing games at 120fps with a 120Hz refresh rate, they will look the same and give the same experience. This means if you largely play, for example, single-player titles at a lower frame rate, there is no benefit spending big on a 540Hz OLED monitor. Where higher refresh rate OLEDs become of benefit is when you use the highest refresh rate capabilities. This 540Hz monitor has tons of scope for high-level competitive gaming at 1440p. So if you're targeting extreme motion clarity and play games above 280fps, there is absolutely a reason to pick this over cheaper 280Hz models. It's clearer, smoother, and offers lower input lag when we compare highest refresh versus highest refresh. It's hard to make a call on whether you need a 540Hz display instead of something with a lower refresh rate. Sometimes these sorts of panels have been labeled as diminishing returns, but personally, I think they present quite a noticeable upgrade, and that's coming from someone that doesn't play a ton of fast-paced titles. At the same time though, 540Hz over 280Hz isn't essential for a great gaming experience in the way that 120Hz is over 60Hz. The other comparison to make is 540Hz WOLED compared to other panels at a similar sort of refresh rate, like 500Hz QD-OLED and previous gen 480Hz WOLED. To me, each generation slightly increasing the refresh rate is more of a marketing tool than something that actually has a practical benefit. 540Hz is just 8% faster than 500Hz and 13% faster than 480Hz, which is very difficult to notice in practice. Motion clarity at 1440p is not a major reason, in my opinion, to choose 540Hz WOLED over 500Hz QD-OLED. The difference is negligible. This latest 540Hz panel does have one trick up its sleeve though, dual mode support. At the press of a button, the PG27AQWP can transform into a 720Hz monitor at the expense of resolution, which decreases to 1280 by 720. I did see some confusion around the announcement of this display as to whether the 720Hz mode runs at 1080p or 720p, I think related to this mode being labelled HD, but now that I have the monitor, it's definitely a 720p configuration. When you toggle this frame rate boost mode, the display offers the same sort of experience as other dual mode monitors. That is to say, the only thing that changes is the refresh rate and resolution. Everything else stays the same, including HDR and adaptive sync support, processing lag, color performance, and so on. It appears to your PC as a different monitor, which helps with game compatibility and prevents the 720p mode from accidentally being enabled in software. The 720p 720Hz mode is exclusively designed for fast-paced gaming, more so than 4K dual mode monitors that run their faster mode at 1080p. 720p is a very low resolution for a 27-inch screen size, and combined with it being a non-native resolution, the output is blurry, especially when viewing anything that benefits from detail. Text, for example, is blurry and a bit pixelated, so you absolutely wouldn't want to use this mode for desktop apps. In addition, you just don't get a lot of resolution real estate, so in modern apps designed for 1080p screens and above, everything feels very cramped and enlarged. Whether the resolution is an issue in games depends on the game you are playing. Most of the time, the game content itself looks fine enough, though obviously not as good as 1440p or even 1080p screens. But the UI can be a bit problematic in some titles because fine line detail looks bad at 720p, small icons can be hard to pass, and text quality is poor. These are all things you can adjust to with experience using this resolution, but it's always going to be a compromised experience compared to playing at 1440p 540Hz. What I feel makes this a niche feature is the fact that 720Hz is not a massive improvement over 540Hz. On other dual mode OLEDs, the difference between 240Hz and 480Hz is significant because we're getting a doubling of the refresh rate. 720Hz, on the other hand, it is clearer than 540Hz, but it's just a 33% increase in refresh, so the differences are on the minor end of the scale. 540Hz 1440p looks excellent, and in a lot of situations this is how I think gamers will prefer to use the screen, whereas the 720Hz 720p mode will be reserved for extreme use cases. That's not to diminish what this display offers at 720Hz, because it's one of the clearest and most responsive experiences you can currently get. The motion clarity is absolutely insane in this configuration, right up there with the best strobed LCDs, and far more flexible as it offers this clarity with full feature support. But the compromise here is pretty tough. Nerfing the resolution from 1440p to 720p is much more significant, in my opinion, than the gain you get going from 540Hz to 720Hz. I'm sure some elite competitive gamers might disagree with me on this, that's just how I see it though. Asus offer two additional features worth talking about. One is ELMB black frame insertion. This feature works at 270 and 120Hz. ELMB at 270Hz enhances clarity to look like 540Hz, and ELMB at 120Hz enhances clarity to look like 240Hz. It does this by technically running at a higher refresh rate, so 720Hz ELMB runs the screen at 540Hz, but it displays every second frame as black. Enabling this feature requires you to disable adaptive sync and HDR. Also, as the 720p dual mode configuration doesn't include a 270Hz refresh rate configuration, ELMB only works at 120Hz in that mode, so it's really only a feature you'd use at 1440p, and there is no way to boost 360Hz up to the clarity of 720Hz. As ELMB is supported only in very specific configurations, it's quite a niche feature. It works, but it's not as advanced as backlight strobing on most LCDs, which use a shorter backlight pulse to achieve much clearer motion clarity. It's a nice bonus feature, though not something I would personally use in most gaming sessions. The second feature is OLED Anti-Flicker, designed to combat variable refresh rate flicker in rare scenarios. It does this by reducing the VRR range through raising the minimum refresh rate. Asus have updated how this feature works compared to previous monitors. Instead of offering multiple anti-flicker modes on the PG27AQWP, it's a simple on-off toggle, with on raising the minimum refresh rate to 240Hz. In all modes, this preserves LFC, though strangely in the 1440p mode, enabling anti-flicker drops the maximum refresh rate slightly to 500Hz. Not sure why, but that's what happens. TFT Central have a great article exploring OLED flicker, why it occurs, and how this anti-flicker mode helps to minimize it. Essentially, on WOLED panels, gamma is tied to refresh rate. Large swings in refresh rate cause visible gamma shifts, which can be perceived as flicker. Narrowing the VRR range reduces the total amplitude of gamma swings during periods of frame rate fluctuation, but doesn't fully eliminate the issue. This aligns with what we've experienced using these modes. Asus anti-flicker mode reduces the severity of flicker, but it doesn't fully eliminate the issue. Input latency is excellent, offering a 0.1 millisecond processing delay in both the 540 and 720Hz configurations in both the SDR and HDR modes, with a slightly higher refresh rate than other models. This puts the PG27AQWP at the top of the charts, though in practice there is a negligible difference in input lag between any OLEDs in the 480 to 500Hz range. What is noticeable is the increase in responsiveness and smoothness compared to 360Hz monitors and especially 280 or 240Hz displays. This 540Hz panel is twice as fast and twice as responsive. Power consumption is as expected. This new 540Hz panel is somewhat more efficient, displaying full white than the previous 480Hz panel, dropping power usage from 59 to 49 watts. However, among 4th gen panels, the higher refresh model does use more power than 280Hz variants. Compared to QD-OLED, we see the usual power advantage viewing white due to the inclusion of a white subpixel in WOLED. For typical mid-APL gaming, there's not a huge difference between this 540Hz WOLED panel and 500Hz QD-OLED. Power consumption is still lower than 480Hz WOLED, but higher than 280Hz 4th gen panels. It's a perfectly acceptable result. As we found with previous reviews of primary RGB tandem WOLED monitors, this new panel brings a major color space improvement compared to previous WOLEDs. Previously, panels typically hit around 97% DCI-P3 coverage. That's been bumped up to 99.7% with this new WOLED, and the difference is even larger when we look at the full Rec 2020 HDR gamut. Last gen WOLEDs all sat in the 72% range, while this new primary RGB tandem WOLED leaps forward to offer 83.6% coverage, which is right up there with the best monitors I've tested, including LCDs. This is a slightly wider color gamut than QD-OLEDs, which were previously the leading OLED technology for color space coverage, and it certainly eliminates the gap in saturation between the two options. Factory calibration in the default configuration is average, the color temperature and gamma are both pretty good, and the Delta E ITP average is fine. Like a lot of wide gamut gaming monitors, the color space is left unclamped for SDR use, leading to oversaturation in content like YouTube videos. This oversaturation is more noticeable on the latest WOLED panels due to their wider color gamut. Compared to other monitors, we're looking at standard average results here, middle of the chart stuff. This display performs pretty well with Windows 11 auto color management. Grayscale results are unaffected, but this display does provide accurate color primaries to the OS, so we get 98% sRGB coverage and very good saturation and color checker results. This sort of configuration is good enough to be classed as factory calibrated. But if you want to take things a step further, Asus offer an excellent sRGB Cal mode, which is the more accurate of the two built-in sRGB modes Asus offer. This mode locks settings, the other option is just to change the color space in the OSD. The sRGB Cal mode has improved grayscale results and even better performance in the color tests. When we compare these results to other monitors, the grayscale numbers are good enough to class as proper factory calibration and sit mid-table overall, no different to some of the 500Hz QD-OLEDs I've tested. Color checker results are fantastic though, cementing this display in top position. Further calibration is not really necessary on this monitor, though of course it's possible. 4th gen WOLED panels introduced a noticeable brightness increase compared to previous generations, and this applies to both the 540Hz and 280Hz panel variants. The PG27AQWP produced a maximum of 334 nits in the SDR mode, which is excellent among OLEDs and approaching the level of LCDs. It's in the same ballpark as other primary RGB tandem panels and is slightly higher than 500Hz QD-OLEDs like the Samsung G60SF, which report in at around 310 nits. Minimum brightness is good at 28 nits. Asus offer a uniform brightness setting which is not enabled by default and caps the monitor to around 334 nits for all window sizes rather than varying brightness as you resize windows, behavior I find annoying. Viewing angles from this WOLED panel are great, no concerns there whatsoever. Typically what you are getting is better than what you'll see from an LCD. Uniformity, perfectly fine when viewing white, but this 4th gen panel does not improve grey uniformity substantially, so there is still some banding and dirty screen effect when viewing uniform dark grey backgrounds. This is not an issue you'll see with QD-OLED, and it can be visible in some desktop apps that use dark grey for the interface. Specifically on the PG27AQWP, I found the dark grey dirty screen effect to be a bit more noticeable than on the 280Hz XG27AQWMG. It might be impossible to capture on camera, but the 540Hz model has a faint horizontal lines artifact across the screen, almost like a pattern or texture is being applied to the image. As far as I can tell, it's not a pixel inversion artifact, and it's not present on the 280Hz panel. It's not a deal breaker because it's quite difficult to see. I only spotted it looking at this screen side by side with QD-OLED and IPS LCDs, but it's something to be aware of. Moving now to the HDR section, and OLEDs are a great choice for HDR, as many people will already know. The main strengths to this panel type are individual pixel control and zero-level blacks, which create high levels of local contrast. With such fine control over the image, OLEDs can display amazing contrast, even if a bright and dark area are right next to each other. Combined with rapid response times and low input lag, OLEDs keep up with the demands of fast-paced HDR gaming without introducing artifacts or delay. The main weakness to OLED for HDR is overall brightness, especially in brighter, high APL scenes. LCDs with zone backlights are the main alternative to OLED, though you won't find one at this sort of speed. No 540Hz models are available. These types of panels get brighter than OLED and don't have burn-in concerns, which might be better suited to your preferences. However, they lack individual pixel control, which in unfavorable scenarios leads to reduced contrast, zone artifacts, and in some cases, weak highlight brightness. Zoned LCDs also have higher input lag, and the backlight can struggle in fast HDR games. The best LCDs still deliver a great overall HDR experience, but OLEDs are typically a better and more premium option for gamers. The PG27AQWP uses a pretty standard Asus set of HDR configurations, and these configurations perform similarly to the 280Hz 4th Gen W OLED from Asus that we looked at previously. There are 4 HDR modes, then a separate toggle called Adjustable HDR, which when enabled allows you to increase brightness and change other settings. You can see the differences between the various modes here, tested using a 2% window size. By default, so with Adjustable HDR disabled, all offer peak brightness of around 600 nits. The Console HDR and Display HDR 500 TrueBlack modes both have stricter roll-off, which is good if you want the source device to perform most of the tone mapping. The Gaming HDR and Cinema HDR modes have a more gentle roll-off at higher brightness, which can be better in certain circumstances. The Gaming, Cinema, and Console modes all report a peak brightness of 1400 nits to Windows, whereas the TrueBlack mode reports 600 nits to Windows, regardless of whether Adjustable HDR is enabled or not. With Adjustable HDR enabled and brightness set to the maximum of 100, now we see peak brightness reach around 1350 nits at a 2% window size in the Gaming, Cinema, and Console modes, with the same roll-off characteristics we saw previously. The TrueBlack mode can be increased to nearly 800 nits. All of these configurations have some overbrightening, so let's take a closer look at Console HDR mode performance. With Adjustable HDR disabled, so the default Console HDR experience, accuracy is excellent in all configurations, but brightness is capped to 600 nits or so. We've seen a lot of these TrueBlack type configurations across OLED monitors we've tested. This one is definitely brighter than what you'll find on most QD-OLEDs, but it still doesn't have especially amazing peak brightness capabilities. With Adjustable HDR enabled and brightness manually increased to 100, now we see up to 1400 nits of peak brightness at small window sizes. But there's a few drawbacks, the main being highlight overbrightening, the same issue you get with other primary RGB tandem monitors in a similar configuration. Essentially, this mode gives you good accuracy in bright scenes with no panel dimming, and good accuracy in dark scenes where the content's brightness is supposed to be below 80 nits. But any on-screen element above 80 nits gets over-brightened, so a highlight that's meant to be, say, 200 nits becomes 400 nits in this mode. This is different to QD-OLED over-brightening, where with some modes the entire screen gets doubled in brightness, even for darker elements, making lower APL scenes look too bright, almost as if the screen is just running at a higher brightness setting. This WOLED panel in this configuration only overbrightens some things that you'll see on screen, usually highlights, which is more acceptable and makes dark content look better relative to overbright QD-OLED configurations. In most content, this mode looks normal and quite accurate, with the exception being brighter than normal highlights. Think streetlights, lightning, and fire displayed among an otherwise dark scene. While I'd prefer not to see overbrightening for the best all-round accuracy, I think most gamers will prefer the look of the Console HDR mode with brightness set to 100, and in general this is a more balanced configuration than the brightest modes QD-OLED has to offer. Synthetic brightness tests are next up, and the PG27AQWP in its Brightness 100 configuration produces 350 nits of full screen brightness, which is similar to other 4th Gen W OLEDs and slightly higher than 500Hz QD OLED. I should note here that there has been a firmware update for the XG27AQWMG that is supposed to improve HDR brightness. I haven't gotten a chance to retest that monitor yet, so these are the launch review numbers. At a 10% window, the PG27AQWP offers an impressive 783 nits of brightness, matching the previous 480Hz W OLED and significantly outperforming 500Hz QD OLED, which even in the brightest configuration is only good for around 550 nits. This makes this new W OLED over 40% brighter. We also see at a 2% window size, brightness of over 1300 nits, which is 16% higher than the last gen panel and at least 25% higher than QD-OLEDs, matching Asus's claims around the brightness this new panel offers. In terms of brightness versus window size, looking across a variety of OLEDs, I think the PG27AQWP offers the best performance yet. It either matches or exceeds other panel types at all window sizes, offering excellent small window results and very good full screen numbers for an OLED as well. In real scene brightness, there's a couple of things to explore. The most accurate mode, console HDR without the brightness boost, is one of the better performing TrueBlack modes I've looked at. It's slightly brighter and more accurate than the TrueBlack 500 mode on the MSI 272QPX50, while offering a 27% better average result than the TrueBlack 400 modes available with lower refresh QD-OLEDs. This mode doesn't give amazing results, but it's nice to see progress for this configuration. The brightest configuration is very solid in real tests. Unlike with QD-OLEDs, there are no panel dimming concerns, and this panel produces better results in high APL bright scenes than even the EOTF boost mode on the 272QPX50, a mode that, as you can see, doesn't fully resolve panel dimming. Highlight brightness is typically either as good or better than this competing QD-OLED model as well, leading to better overall brightness characteristics in the HDR mode. The consistency of this panel across a wide range of tests is key, and while there is still that weakness of over-brightening and low APL scenes affecting accuracy, the package offered here is top tier among OLEDs right now. Relative to older models like the PG27AQWP that this new monitor directly replaces, brightness performance is also quite a bit better. Both low and high APL brightness is better on the new model, so average brightness has increased by 15%, and the PG27AQWP was one of the best performing W OLEDs from the previous generation of panels. Dark scene accuracy using a 10% window is not amazing, but also not terrible using the highest brightness mode, and it's pretty good just in the regular console HDR mode. This test is where QD-OLEDs excel. Bright scene accuracy though is very solid whether we use the brightest mode or not, and this level of performance is only exceeded by MSI's EOTF boost mode. I also saw really good color results from this display, showing good attention to detail as often only brightness is calibrated for. As I noted in other primary RGB tandem monitor reviews, color volume has increased with this new panel due to an increase in color gamut and brightness. In its brightest configuration, the PG27AQWP delivers a 29% higher result than the previous model. Compared to QD-OLED, it still falls short though, as color brightness isn't as good on this W-OLED panel despite increases to gamut coverage and white brightness. It's much closer to parity than it was, but the latest 500Hz QD-OLEDs have a 12% lead in this metric. Asus do a good job of advertising this monitor as seen in the Essentials checklist. There's the usual concerns around weird response time numbers, and also while it may pass some flicker-free certifications, it's also not technically flicker-free as W-OLED has a short pulse at each refresh. This causes eye strain for a very small minority of users. The name is bad though. This is another Asus word salad product name. It's far too long, has too many words, and has a long, unintelligible product code. Like many Asus monitors, the difference between this product and another often comes down to a single letter partway through the name. In this case, the W in AQWP is crucial. A much simpler name is needed here. In the feature support matrix, we see a wide range of included features such as excellent contrast and motion results. There's only a few things holding this product back from being a feature-complete flagship monitor, such as the omission of USB-C and a KVM switch, and the lack of Dolby Vision support. Ultimately, the Asus ROG Swift PG27AQWP-W is an excellent high refresh rate 1440p gaming monitor. This display sets a new standard for 500Hz monitors thanks to its primary RGB tandem W-OLED panel that brings better performance and new features to the table, including a 720p 720Hz dual mode. If you're after the ultimate in 1440p gaming, this display is it. The PG27AQWP does many things well. At 1440p, the 540Hz refresh rate isn't that much higher than its competitors, but it does offer outstanding motion clarity that is particularly beneficial in fast-paced games. If you love playing competitive shooters and regularly push frame rates above 300 FPS, the insane refresh rate and speed of OLED panels will take your gaming experience to the next level. This is a very low latency, very responsive, super fast panel that offers all of this inner configuration without the restrictions of the best backlight strobing solutions on LCDs. Plus, as an OLED, it looks better and offers a higher resolution than premium esports-oriented TNs. The primary RGB tandem panel offers the exact same experience that we saw earlier this year on 280Hz models. This is a significant upgrade for W-OLED, bringing a wider color gamut and increased brightness across the board. Whether you're using the display in the SDR or HDR mode, The PG27AQWP is the brightest and most consistently bright high refresh OLED on the market. It has excellent black depth, an amazing contrast ratio, and the usual per pixel control benefits we see from OLED panels, leading to fantastic HDR image quality. Asus are one of the best monitor manufacturers today in terms of tuning and feature support, and that's no exception with the AQWP. This display has an excellent factory sRGB mode, great accuracy for the most part in the HDR mode with no pesky panel dimming, and tons of useful features including the Neo proximity sensor, anti-flicker feature, configurable color modes, and DisplayPort 2.1 UHBR20. What I also love about this panel is the TrueBlack glossy coating, an improvement on the previous 480Hz WOLED panel that was matte. This is the best glossy finish on the market, offering a clearly better experience than QD-OLED for most users because it doesn't suffer from raised blacks in brighter environments. Combined with the benefits of this 4th gen WOLED panel itself, this monitor produces stunning image quality. I'm less convinced or enthusiastic about the 720Hz dual mode, which nerfs the screen to just a 720p resolution. Yes, the clarity here is amazing, but it's not that much better than the 540Hz mode that runs at the full 1440p resolution. It just isn't as beneficial as other dual mode monitors with the 4K base resolution, which not only doubled the refresh rate, but also still offered at least a 1080p resolution. 720p is just a bit too much of a sacrifice given the small improvement we get in clarity. At $1,000 US, the PG27AQWP enters the market at the same price as its predecessor, the 480Hz PG27AQDP, which seems reasonable given the AQWP is a much better monitor. It is, however, a bit more expensive than some 500Hz QD-OLEDs, such as the MSI 272QPX50, which has an MSRP of $850 US and is currently selling for as low as $750. Does it make sense to spend $150 to $250 more on the AQWP? If you're just after the best motion clarity at 1440p for competitive games, there is little difference between these models, so I'd recommend saving some money and buying a 500Hz QD-OLED instead. But if you want the better overall product with better HDR performance and a better screen coating, or if you may genuinely use the 720Hz mode, then it could be worth spending more to get the AQWP. In this sort of high-end price point, there is always a premium associated with the best of the best, and it's more justifiable in this segment than in other parts of the market. As a reminder though, if you don't play games at super high refresh rates, you can get a very similar experience in terms of SDR and HDR performance, brightness and so on with 280Hz 4th gen WOLED instead. The Asus XG27AQWMG with the same glossy finish is the direct equivalent here, and it costs just $600 US, so keep that one in mind. And of course you can check out the review of that monitor here on the channel as well. So anyway, that's it for this one. Super long review, not going to waste any more time. If you want to support the channel directly, we have Patreon, links to that is in the description below. If you found this monitor review useful, if you're going to purchase one of these products, then supporting us on Patreon is a great way to say thanks. Alternatively, you can just check the links in the description below. We've got links to pricing and all sorts of things. So anyway, that's it. Thank you, and I'll catch you in the next one.